The vacuum seal does not center the axle. What centers the axle is the needle bearing. If you have slop, you have play between the axle stub and the needle bearing. Okay guys, so I bought aftermarket bearings, and the bearings that were in the truck were probably aftermarket too. But this part number was different on one. I took it back to the parts store and got a different one, and there was a huge difference in this needle bearing back here. Right in here, this needle bearing, 100% different than the needle bearing that was in the other unit. Now everything else fit the same. The studs were the same, the sensor was the same, those studs were the same, everything was the same. The only difference was the color of the grease in here wasn't green. It was white, yellow looking. It's very sticky grease, so I don't know what that is. But I did a series of things here. So I want to show you this seal so you guys understand what you're dealing with here when you press this in. So you know, this is what you're looking at when you're pressing the seal on. I'll just show you the tool I made. Really simple, okay? This is a system that is constructed of 1 1/4 inch pipe, okay? Everything here is under the category of 1 1/4. Not the threads, but the pipe size, apparently. This is a flange, a pipe flange or a floor flange, and this is a pipe cap. And this is just a section of pipe that is long enough. And so the bottom of this is not flat, as you can see. But let me show you, no matter whether you have the tool or not, what is going to happen to your aftermarket vacuum seals. If you look at this, you can see that this center area right here is high, and that the part sort of slopes down as you go towards the outside here. And that is because this is made out of an incredibly chintzy pot metal, and you can actually physically feel a difference in weight between this and the Spicer unit. When you go to Motor or Ford and they give you one $60 or something like that for a Spicer unit and a Motorcraft bag, you can get the Spicer units at O'Reilly. They do not collapse like this, okay? But let me show you what's inside there. So you basically have these S curves that are mated together. You can see like each piece of metal is an S shape, and it's got S shapes mated to it of different sizes, and then the rubber is sealed around all of them to create the vacuum seal. So when you're pressing on this, just so you understand, if you're curious, is it able to press this outer seal section using this inner seal section? The answer to that is yes. Now why that matters is the bearing goes inside here, and it sets right there, and it actually, you know, it rests against the thrust washer, is where it's supposed to rest against. But it also, you know, in theory, right, because there's an install tool for this, I had to grind my pipe flange down to get it to fit inside the middle area, but that was what I did to install it onto the axle. Because this is a strong load-bearing part on the Spicer unit, but on the aftermarket unit it is just a piece of worthless pot metal that immediately collapses when you begin to install it. The only way that you could successfully get this would be with a hydraulic press. When you strike this, I very much doubt that there would be any way to not collapse this. You could potentially get it in there, but I'll bet you that the Spicer one you could get in with a hammer. I really do, because it didn't collapse at all, and I used this exact same tool on this, okay? But I did grind around the edges of that tool, but again, you do not want to press off of this outside. The custom tool that you buy for these trucks has a foot that comes down a little bit farther for this inner part, and then there's a higher up part that contacts this ring right here. So it actually holds them at a certain depth to each other, versus when you use this device and you're only pressing on the outside rings right here, and you're crushing in the outer edge of that inner lip, and that's destructive to that. And then if you just press on this inner lip, in theory, it's kind of using its outer edge to drag this shiny part with it. So in theory, that tool does do one more additional thing that my tool does not do. But I have inspected inside of here, and I can tell you with confidence that you can see, let's see, so right here is the portion that you would be pressing against. See, you would be pressing against that on the top right there. And where that is hooked on here, you can see it hooks directly onto the main body of that outer seal. The outer seal is the thickest piece of metal here, that piece right there, and the inner portion, as long as you're putting nice even pressure on it, you're pushing on it in such a way that it's not going to destroy this outer seal edge. All it's going to do is force it in there. Now as far as that being pressed, you're right, it could be that this outer seal is not in all the way. But here's another critical factor. This is a unit that I just installed and took out because you see how it ramped down around the edges here? This outer seal was barely able to go into my hub, whereas the national seal went right in. Or not national. The Spicer seal went right in almost to its full depth, which would mean that all I have to do is just give it a couple nice taps around this outer rim and we'll be good to go on that outside seal positioning. That seal does have a certain positioning to it, but best I can tell, it's seated as it should be. Basically the jiggle was found, let's see if I can show you U-joints here. There you go. The jiggle was found putting a pry bar under the U-joint right there, and it wasn't a bad U-joint. It was the fact that the axle wasn't being supported. So I thought that the axle was supposed to be supported by the vacuum seal, but I was dead wrong. The issue was a bad clearance on this needle bearing right here. And I know that seems strange that a needle bearing would be expected to manage sort of a torsional load, but just remember this needle bearing is only supporting the inner portion of the shaft right there, and then the hub locker should actually be supporting the tip of the shaft, and of course the inner end of the shaft there is supported at the differential. So that needle bearing is your hypercritical component. I would say, if you are going to get aftermarket, make sure that whatever it is, it's got to come with a really good needle bearing inside here. And I'm getting to where now I don't trust aftermarket bearings at all. The Ford bearing is like $375 for this. The way that the axle stub is supported on this system is using that needle bearing on the inside of the hub bearing assembly. That needle bearing is very critical. The clearances have to be perfect. Truth be told, I don't see how that can be expected to be straight to the axle shaft when the axle shaft is not actually locked into the hub locker assembly has a certain degree of wiggle to it, and you can tell that by just putting your hands on it and moving it around. But what I did is I added grease to the splines, so you have outer splines where the locker assembly drops in, and then you have inner splines on the axle shaft. And so what I did is I kind of got this tacky grease that I use for my grease gun for all purposes, and I just put that, I filled in a lot of those splines on the inner spline, and outer spline is a lot deeper and thicker, and so you could put a ton of grease in there, but that could make a pretty big difference. I know that when I added grease, I noticed a major difference. I think that you can install that vacuum seal with the bearing, but you're instructed not to. I'm not sure why that is. There could be various reasons why. I'm sure the engineers had some thoughts on that and some experimentation involved in figuring that out. But having a special tool to install that, I'm kind of on the borderline about that. I think there's a possibility that you don't actually need a special tool, and that you would do just as well just putting the axle shaft onto the bearing. If you have the bearing in a vise or something, put the axle shaft on top and just tap that in, or put the axle shaft up, facing up, and take the bearing and hit it in, because if you think about it, that bearing is meant to take a lot of impact. You're driving down the road, and the road impacts that transfer into your vehicle goes straight through that bearing. It goes in through the wheel, through the studs, into where the studs are mounted into the bearing assembly, and then they shock load that bearing. So if you think about it, I find it unlikely that would damage the bearing, and I also find it unlikely that it damages the seal. Now that I've further inspected the seal, I would say I think if you're using aftermarket seals, you can't get away with much. But just get the Spicer seals. It's not that much more money, and it is worth it. It makes a huge difference in the install process. It is just not worth your time and trouble trying to install the aftermarket seals. They are not good enough. They're a different material. They're not constructed tough, and the tolerances are wrong. Back to the slop issue. You know, there are 3 points of support for this axle. The center, you know, in the differential area, there's a seal in there, and a gear, of course, or a spline that it goes into, and that supports one end of it. And then you have the middle section allegedly being supported by that tiny little needle bearing, which is grease every 60,000 miles according to the manual. And then you know, the outside tip of the axle. The hub locker doesn't maintain tightness. You know, on a Dodge truck, when you have a spindle nut, spindle lock nut tightens in on that outer shaft. The shaft has a thread on the end of it, and you tighten that down. That makes it become one with the bearing. Obviously, that system doesn't have the ability of becoming unlocked. This was a creative solution by Ford, and it also gave them the capability of shifting into low gear in 2-wheel drive. So if you're towing some heavy loads and you don't want to deal with steering left to right while your 4-low is on, you know, then obviously this is going to be very helpful for you. I don't find it very convenient that I have to go out there and shift these hub lockers into the lock position whenever I want 4-wheel drive, but I have spoken with some people who know about this system, and from what I understand, these elements that are able to turn with the 4-wheel drive are not really meant to turn at highway speeds. And so basically, you're probably not supposed to go more than 45 or 50 in 4-wheel drive, and you are supposed to undo the lockers. You know, even if your transfer case is disengaged, you know, wheels are still going to be turning those axle shafts and creating motion on that vacuum seal. The vacuum seal does not have a bearing in it. It is just metal and rubber, and there's grease in there, but that thing, even though it does spin, is not truly able to spin that fast that much of the time. The needle bearing seems to be a very light duty item. I'm not sure, but this system essentially appears that it was just meant to be functional for specific times and places, not all the time, not frequent, not many miles. It's supposed to be unlocked, sitting there still, axle shafts not moving 99% of the time. Oh yeah, the vacuum seal does not center the axle. The vacuum seal does not center the axle. The vacuum seal does not center the axle. Did I say that already? The vacuum seal does not center the axle. What centers the axle is the needle bearing. If you have slop, you have play between the axle stub and the needle bearing. That is all. Please believe me, I did all the legwork on this. It is true. So don't waste your time replacing all those other components. If you have slop, you can grease the outer hub locker, the splines on the outer and inner splines on the hub locker, and you can grease the thrust washers, and that will help you a little bit. Replacing the vacuum seal will not help with U-joint slop. It's very deceptive, but you can put your hand inside that inner core of it and move it around, move it back and forth. It's basically meant to sit still, is what it is. It's meant to sit still. The needle bearing centers the inner stub. It is literally the support. I'm surprised. It's quite shocking to me that that is the case. But and then also the tube seal, which is like $7 aftermarket. The tube seals do not, which is the part that covers up the actual axle tube when you install the axle itself. Those do not center it either. So it's deceptive because you can't really tell by looking at the system from the outside. But that is the main issue there, and hopefully you guys are able to make use of this information. All right, good luck out there.